Since the 19th century, whenever people talk about the moment Russia finally shook off the rule of the steppe, almost every textbook, movie, and collective memory points to one name: Kulikovo, 1380. That's the battle everyone remembers as the birth of Russian identity, the first time Moscow dared to face the Golden Horde head-on. But here's a truth that rarely gets said out loud. Kulikovo was more symbolic than decisive militarily and politically. It didn't end the Mongol-Tatar yoke. Moscow still had to bow for decades afterward. Yet Russian history does contain moments when the balance truly shifted. Moments went away. A war that had dominated for centuries finally ran into a system designed specifically to stop it, and actually succeeded. One of those moments came in 1572 in a small village most people have never heard of called Molodi. If Kulikovo is the story of defiance, Molodi is the story of survival. The enemy wasn't a weakened remnant of the Golden Horde. It was the Crimean Khanate at the height of its power, backed by the mighty Ottoman Empire. Just 1 year earlier in 1571, these same forces had marched into Russia and burned Moscow to the ground.
Wow.
Tens of thousands were killed or captured. Facing them was a young, devastated Russia with no margin for error and no room for another defeat. This time, there were only two outcomes: win or disappear. In the early 1570s, Tsar Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, was under pressure from almost every direction at once. Militarily, economically, and diplomatically, Muscovy was stretched thin. And nowhere was that more obvious than in the long, grinding war it was fighting in the West. That war was the Livonian War, which had already been dragging on for more than a decade by that point. It began in 1558 when Muscovy launched an invasion of Livonia, meaning to seize control of key ports on the Baltic Sea. Those ports mattered more than they might sound today. In the 16th century, access to the Baltic meant access to European trade, weapons, skilled craftsmen, silver, and political leverage. Without it, Muscovy was largely landlocked and economically isolated. At first, Ivan's armies moved fast. Territory fell quickly, and for a moment, it looked like Muscovy might actually break into the Baltic world. But by the 1560s, the situation changed. Stronger and better organized opponents entered the fight: Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, and local Livonian forces. What had started as a rapid offensive turned into a slow, expensive stalemate. Year after year, Muscovy poured men, money, and supplies into the Western Front, with fewer gains to show for it each season. Strain was unmistakable. The army was overstretched. The treasury was bleeding. And although the war wouldn't formally end until the early 1580s, the outcome was already becoming clear. Muscovy would be forced to accept ceasefires and walk away from most of its Baltic ambitions. In simple terms, years of fighting had produced exhaustion, not victory. But while Ivan's attention and most of his troops were locked in the West, something else had been happening in the South. In the decades before the Livonian War stalled, Muscovy had expanded aggressively along the Volga River. In 1552, Ivan captured the Kazan Khanate. 4 years later, in 1556, he took Astrakhan. Together, these conquests gave Muscovy control over the entire Volga basin, stretching its influence all the way toward the Caspian Sea. That wasn't just a territorial gain, it was a strategic transformation. Control of the Volga meant control over trade routes linking Eastern Europe to Central Asia and Persia, along with new tax revenues and political influence. But those victories came with a price. They triggered alarm bells in Istanbul. For the Ottoman Empire, the Volga-Caspian region was part of a broader network of trade routes, religious influence, and geopolitical balance, standing between. The Ottomans and Muscovy was one of their most important partners on the steppe. The Crimean Khanate. For more than a century, Crimean Tatar raids had been a constant threat to Muscovy's southern borders. These were large-scale organized campaigns, designed to seize livestock, loot towns, and most importantly, capture people. Tens of thousands of captives over generations were sold through Crimean markets into slavery across the Ottoman world. This was a central pillar of the Crimean economy, and a strategic tool supported directly or indirectly by Ottoman power. The late 1560s. Ottoman leaders began looking for ways to reassert control over the Volga region and counter Muscovy's expansion. One of the most ambitious ideas they attempted came in 1569, a plan to dig a canal connecting the Don River to the Volga, if completed. This waterway would allow ships to travel from the Caspian Sea to the Sea of Azov, and from there into the Black Sea, effectively linking Ottoman-controlled waters into the heart of Eurasia. It was a brilliant idea. However, in reality, it was a logistical nightmare. The terrain was harsh, the distances enormous, and the engineering challenges far beyond what could realistically be handled under constant military pressure. Russian forces harassed the project. Supplies ran short and the effort collapsed before the canal could be completed. Still, the attempt itself sent a clear message. Istanbul viewed Astrakhan and the Volga as strategically vital and Muscovy as a growing problem. All of this tension came to a head in 1571 that year. Devlet Giray, the Crimean Khan, launched a massive campaign into Russian territory. The timing was perfect from his perspective. Muscovy's main armies were still tied down. In the Livonian War, hundreds of miles to the west, the traditional defensive line along the Oka River, normally reinforced with troops and fortifications, was thinly manned and poorly supported. Crimean forces broke through. They rode deep into the Russian heartland, with speed and coordination that Muscovy simply couldn't match at the time. Too many soldiers were fighting elsewhere, and there was no quick way to bring them back. On May 24, 1571, the Crimean army reached Moscow. The Tatars set fire to the wooden suburbs surrounding the city. Strong winds did the rest. Within hours, some accounts say as few as 6, the fires merged into a single massive inferno. Moscow, a city built largely of wood, burned on a scale almost impossible to imagine today. Contemporary estimates and later studies suggest tens of thousands died, many from smoke inhalation and fire rather than direct violence. Thousands more were captured and carried south as slaves. The exact numbers vary wildly depending on the source, but no one disputes the scale of the catastrophe. Western observers like Jerome Horsey later wrote that clearing bodies and rebuilding the city took more than a year. That alone tells you how severe the destruction was. Ivan IV fled Moscow, retreating north toward Rostov. Some sources suggest Ivan was willing to negotiate, possibly even to make concessions. Devlet Giray had no interest in compromise anyway. Fresh off his victory, he reportedly boasted to the Ottoman Sultan that Russia was finished. He claimed he would conquer the entire country, capture the Tsar himself, and divide Russian lands among his nobles. This was no longer a raid for plunder. This was an invasion aimed at ending Russian sovereignty altogether. At the same time, Muscovy was facing deadly pressure from the outside. It was also tearing itself apart from within. The core of that internal crisis was a policy called the Oprichnina. Ivan created it in 1565, and it lasted until 1572. In theory, it was a security measure. One half, the Oprichnina, was ruled directly by the Tsar himself. The other, the Zemshina, was left to the traditional state bureaucracy and the boyar nobility, two chains of command in one country. To enforce this system, Ivan built a personal force known as the Oprichniki. They were hard to miss. Contemporary descriptions talk about men dressed in black, riding black horses, carrying symbols like a dog's head and a broom meant to show that they would sniff out traitors and sweep them away. Their actual job was political terror, arrests, confiscations, executions, and mass expulsions of noble families suspected of disloyalty. Over time, the damage became structural. Experienced commanders were sidelined or executed because they were suspected of betrayal. Meanwhile, men promoted for their loyalty to the Tsar often had little real battlefield experience. That weakness showed itself brutally in 1571, when Moscow burned and there was no effective defense to stop it. That disaster forced a moment of clarity. The Oprichniki were good at terrorizing civilians and terrible at stopping steppe cavalry. Ivan could no longer ignore the evidence. A divided command structure and a paralyzed military were a death sentence. When facing enemies like the Crimean Khanate, so in 1572, just as another invasion loomed, Ivan made a decisive move. The Aprakanina was abolished. Its lands and forces were merged back into the Zemshina, restoring a single, unified military command. It was an admission, even if never stated openly, that internal division had nearly destroyed the state. With that reorganization came a new focus on defense. And one man quickly emerged as central to it, Prince Mikhail Vorotensky. Vorotensky was a professional soldier and, more importantly, a man who understood the southern frontier. For years he had worked on strengthening Russia's defenses using a system known as the Great Abadi Belt. This was a vast network of felled trees, trenches, and earthworks designed to block movement, slow cavalry, and force attackers into narrow, predictable routes. Against steppe armies that relied on speed and open terrain, this mattered enormously. It didn't stop raids entirely, but it bought time. By the summer of 1572, the stage was set for a direct confrontation between two armies with two completely different ways of war. On one side stood the tradition of steppe mobility, fast horse archers, fluid movement, constant harassment. On the other stood a centralized state beginning to rely on firearms, field fortifications, and coordinated command. The army advancing toward Russia that year was no minor force. Develet Jaray's host was large, diverse, and dangerous. Contemporary chronicles sometimes claim numbers as high as 120,000 or even 150,000 men. But modern historians are far more cautious. Scholars like Vitaly Penskoy estimate the real strength at roughly 40,000 to 60,000 troops, still an enormous army by 16th century standards. At its core was Crimean cavalry, the backbone of the force. These were highly trained, mounted archers who could ride for days, strike quickly, and disappear before an enemy could respond. Their standard tactic was to wear opponents down. Constant arrow fire, feigned retreats, sudden flanking attacks until resistance collapsed. The Ottoman Sultan had sent approximately 7,000 janissaries to accompany the campaign.
Janissaries
Were among the most disciplined and effective infantry units in the world at the time, trained to use firearms in coordinated volleys. Their presence made one thing unmistakably clear. This was not just a Crimean raid. It was an operation officially, backed by Istanbul. Supporting them were additional units, Nogay cavalry, Circassian contingents, and Ottoman-provided artillery. Prince Mikhail Vorotensky's Russian army was smaller, much smaller. Most modern estimates place it somewhere between 20,000 and 35,000 men, depending on which units you count and when you start counting them. Against an enemy force that may have reached 60,000, this was not the kind of matchup you normally want to fight in open country. And yet Vorotensky had something that changed the entire equation. At the heart of that system were the Streltsy, Russia's first permanent state-organized infantry force. These were full-time soldiers trained to fight together and equipped with matchlock firearms. Each man also carried a heavy Bardish axe, which served two purposes. It worked as a brutal close combat weapon, and it doubled as a firing rest too. Stabilize their guns. That detail matters. Early firearms were slow and awkward to use. But when hundreds of men fired in coordinated volleys from fixed positions, the effect was devastating, especially against cavalry charging into a storm of lead. Backing up the Streltsy was another important component: foreign professionals. Roughly 7,000 German and other Western European mercenaries were present, bringing with them experience in artillery, field fortifications, and siege warfare. These men had fought in the wars of Central Europe, where gunpowder warfare was already well established. But the real centerpiece of Vorotensky's plan, the thing that turns Molodi from a battle into a case study, was something called the Gulia Gorod, often translated as a mobile fort. Imagine thick oak shields pre-built in sections, each mounted on wheels or sledges. They were designed to stop arrows and resist small arms fire. Crucially, they were cut with firing ports, allowing muskets and light artillery to shoot from behind. Solid cover. This idea evolved from the wagon fort tactics used by the Hussites and German armies earlier in the century. But at Molodi, it was adapted perfectly to the southern Russian steppe. Wide, flat land with almost no natural defenses. Once assembled, the Kulikovo could be moved, rearranged, and locked together to form temporary fortresses almost anywhere. In practical terms, it turned an open-field battle into something closer to a siege, except the city could shift its position, and that's where the magic happened. The campaign truly began on July 26th, in 1572, when Devlet Gire's main army reached the Oka River near Serpukhov. This river had long been one of Muscovy's traditional defensive lines, but this time it offered little resistance. A small Russian advance detachment, about 200 noble cavalrymen, was quickly overwhelmed. The Tatars crossed the river, almost effortlessly, and turned south to north, heading straight toward Moscow. To Devlet Gire, everything looked familiar. Just 1 year earlier, in 1571, this exact sequence had ended with the Russian capital in flames and the Tsar fleeing for his life. There was no reason, he believed, to expect anything different now. The Russian army seemed weak. The frontier defenses had already been breached. In his mind, Moscow was already lost. But this time, instead of rushing to block the crossings as Muscovy had done so many times before, Prince Mikhail Vorotensky made a very different choice. He ordered his army to follow the Crimean force from behind, staying close but out of reach. It was a dangerous move. Shadowing a larger, faster enemy meant constant risk of being turned on and destroyed in the open. But strategically, it was brilliant. This pursuit strategy created a dilemma for Devlet Gire. If he ignored the Russians behind him and continued toward Moscow, he risked having his rear attacked while his army was stretched out and busy with a siege. If he turned back to deal with them, he would lose momentum and time. For 2 days, the tension built. Then on July 28th, the trap was sprung. A Russian advance force led by Prince Dmitry Korostinin launched a sudden and aggressive attack on the Crimean rear near the village of Molodi. Aimed directly at the vulnerable tail of the army, supply wagons, support units, and less protected cavalry. The damage was serious enough that Devlet Gire had no choice. He halted the march on Moscow and ordered his entire army to turn around and eliminate this threat behind him. This was exactly what Vorotensky wanted. By forcing the Crimean army to reverse direction, he pulled it away from Moscow and toward ground that had already been chosen and prepared for a defensive stand. 2 days later, on July 30th, the first major clash took place. The Russian army had positioned itself on a hill near the Rizai River, a modest rise in the landscape but enough to matter. There they assembled the Kulikovo, locking together thick oak shields mounted on wheels, to form a temporary wooden fortress in the middle of the open steppe. When the Crimean cavalry surged forward, expecting to scatter infantry in the open, they instead slammed into a wall of fire. From behind the oak panels, Streltsy musketeers and supporting artillery unleashed coordinated volleys. Matchlock guns cracked. Light cannons roared. Smoke rolled across the field. Horses went down. Riders fell. The Crimean horse archers tried what had worked for generations, circling, harassing, raining arrows down to break formations, but their arrows bounced harmlessly off the thick oak shields. The Kulikovo simply refused to give them anything. To exploit, over the next 2 days, the battle settled into something grim and exhausting. More like a pressure cooker slowly being turned up. On July 31st, Devlet Gire committed most of his remaining strength. We're not talking about a probing attack or light harassment. This was the bulk of the Crimean army. Tens of thousands of men pushed forward in coordinated waves against the Russian position. And once again, they were driven back. The losses piled up quietly but steadily, men falling under musket fire, horses collapsing under artillery blasts, units losing cohesion as they tried to retreat across open ground. Then came August 1st, and this was supposed to be the turning point. Devlet Gire handed the attack to Devlet Mirza, one of the most respected and battle-hardened commanders in the entire Tatar world. This was a man whose reputation alone could stiffen morale and intimidate enemies. When Devlet Mirza led an assault, people expected results. The fighting that day spilled out beyond the wooden walls of the Kulikovo and turned into brutal hand-to-hand combat. Packed bodies, shields splintering, swords and spears at arm's length, smoke hanging low over the grass. And then something happened that nobody on the Crimean side expected. The Russian troops broke the attack, and in the chaos, they captured Dave Mirza himself, alive. That single moment hit the Crimean army like a hammer. Morale cracked. Confidence wavered. But here's the part people often miss. Inside the Russian position, things were getting desperate too. The Russians had never planned for a long siege. Food stocks were limited. Supply lines were cut. Within days, hunger turned from discomfort into crisis. Soldiers began slaughtering their own horses, the most valuable asset in any early modern army, just to stay alive. Every horse killed meant less mobility, less hauling power, less hope if they had to retreat. The Crimean scouts noticed. They could see it. And Devlet adjusted his strategy. Instead of attacking head-on, he stopped. The plan now was simple and cruel. Wait, let hunger do the work. Let the Russians starve behind their wooden walls. At this point, the battle was balanced on a knife's edge. And that's when the Russians played their boldest card. With food nearly gone and ammunition running low, the Russian commanders knew they didn't have much time. That's when Voivode Yuri Tokmakov came up with a plan. He ordered a messenger to carry a fake letter supposedly addressed to Prince Voritinsky. The message was short and confident. Hold fast. A massive Nogai army, 40,000 men, led by Tsar Ivan IV himself, is marching south to relieve you. The messenger was meant to be caught, and he was. The Tatars intercepted him, killed him, and delivered the letter straight to Devlet. Gyra. Now pause for a second and think about this from the Khan's perspective. His army was already stalled. One of his best generals was gone. Supplies were being burned fast. And now he's reading a message claiming that 40,000 fresh Russian troops might soon appear behind him. That was the nightmare scenario. Steppe warfare depended on mobility. Being boxed in was fatal. Devlet panicked. Not irrationally, but strategically, waiting suddenly became too dangerous. He couldn't afford to starve the Russians anymore. So he made a decision that would define the entire campaign. On August 2nd, Devlet Gizre ordered a full-scale, all-or-nothing assault. And here's the detail that tells you just how desperate the situation had become. Ordered his cavalry to dismount. For a steppe army, this was almost unthinkable. Dismounting meant abandoning their greatest advantage. Men slammed into thick oak shields, hacking at them with axes, trying to tear them apart with bare hands. Imagine the noise. Wood splintering, iron striking iron, men shouting over the crack of muskets fired at point-blank range. But this was exactly the moment Prince Mikhail Voritinsky had been waiting for. While the entire Ottoman Tatar army focused on smashing the Kulikovo from the front, Voritinsky quietly slipped a detached force of cavalry and Cossacks out the rear of the fortress, including fighters under Mickey Cherkassky, and led them through a nearby valley, completely hidden from view. Then at the precise moment the enemy was fully committed, Prince Dmitry Kvarostinin threw open the gates of the Kulikovo and charged straight out the front. The Ottoman Tatar army suddenly realized they were inside a double envelopment. Hit from the front by a Russian sortie and slammed from behind by fresh cavalry crashing into their rear, panic spread faster than commands could travel. Units broke formation. Orders stopped making sense. Soldiers turned around and found Russians where their supply lines were supposed to be. What had been an assault collapsed into chaos almost instantly, and chaos in an army that large is deadly. The retreat turned into a rout. The rout turned into slaughter. Russian forces pursued the fleeing Tatars relentlessly, cutting them down all the way back toward the Oka River. Many never made it that far. Out of an army estimated at over 60,000, only about 20,000 Crimean cavalrymen are believed to have made it home. That means 2/3 of the army was killed, captured, or dispersed beyond recovery. Devlet Gizre fled so quickly that he abandoned his own tent, banners, and camp equipment. The losses at the top were just as devastating. His son, grandson, and most of his senior commanders died, either during the battle or in the disastrous retreat. Russian losses were far smaller by comparison, estimated between 4,000 and 6,000 men. But for Vorotinsky's much smaller army, that was still a heavy price. It was survival by the thinnest margin. The result, though, was decisive. After Molodi, the Crimean Khanate simply could not launch another deep invasion of Russia for nearly 20 years. The centuries-old pattern of steppe armies riding north, burning cities, and carrying off tens of thousands of captives was broken for good. The fear that had haunted the Slavic lands since the Mongol era finally cracked. Historically, Molodi belongs in the same category as Kulikovo in 1380 or Borodino in 1812, battles that changed the direction of Russian history. And yet it barely shows up in Western textbooks, and even in Russia it often gets sidelined. There are reasons for that. One of them is political embarrassment. Lodi proved beyond argument that Ivan IV's Oprichnina had failed. The country was saved not by the Tsar's feared personal guard, but by the traditional Zemsina forces under Vorotinsky. That reality forced Ivan to abolish the Oprichnina later in 1572. He went so far as to ban the very word Oprichnina under penalty of death and attempted to reintegrate the state, though the damage was already done. Ivan IV could not tolerate rivals, especially successful ones. Instead of rewarding the man who had saved the state, Ivan arrested Mikhail Vorotinsky in 1573, accusing him of absurd crimes including using sorcery to harm the Tsar. Ivan personally oversaw his torture. Hot coals were forced into Vorotinsky's body with iron rods. He died from these injuries while being transported to the Kirillo-Belozersky monastery. When a regime executes its own victorious commander's history, tends to go quiet. Celebrating Molodi meant remembering someone the Tsar had destroyed. So the battle became awkward, then sensitive, then forgotten. Geopolitically, Molodi ended Ottoman ambitions along the Volga. It secured Russia's southern frontier at a moment when the country was under pressure on every side, preserved territorial integrity. It opened the door for eastward expansion into Siberia, and it permanently shifted the balance of power. From 1572 onward, the Crimean Khanate slowly moved from aggressor to defender, eventually facing Russian counterattacks in the 18th century instead of launching its own invasions. Molodi closed the chapter on an entire era of steppe domination, and did it in a way few people ever talk about.